Something evil lives in the Sahara desert. The distress call came at 3 in the morning, while we were all sleeping. Nolan was an easy riser, and he was the one who went from hotel room to hotel room, urgently waking up the rest of us, after he saw the message on his phone. 3 simple letters, offering no explanation, but telling us that our help was urgently needed. SOS. The adrenaline rush assured that none of us was still half asleep or in need of coffee when we convened in Rebecca's hotel room, which had been doubling as our conference center for when we would have to make calls back to the university or just meet among ourselves. Archaeologist stationed in Cairo, the capital of Egypt, very close to the iconic pyramids, which define most of the thought that pops up into people's minds when they think of this land. In particular, when we were tasked with studying potential ancient Egyptian settlements that lay beyond the reach of the Nile River, aside from some very rudimental urban areas that were centered around the oasis. Ancient Egypt's civilization was completely dependent on the Nile, relying on its nutrient-rich waters to sustain its agricultural economy. So when the recent satellite images showed potential ruins right in the middle of the desert, far from the Nile or any known current ancient oasis, our archaeological team was sent to investigate. The day before, 4 of us, Christine, Daniel, Cameron and Greg, had packed all the supplies they would need for the overnight trip. Location was supposed to be a 6-hour drive through the desert from Cairo, just long enough for them to do a preliminary survey of the site and drive back to report any findings to the whole group the next day so we could figure out how to proceed, rather than arriving back at the planned time of 6 in the morning. They sent a distress call using the emergency satellite phone at around 3 in the morning. "We need to go out for them," Rebecca said, her voice commanding and unwavering as always. "We don't know what happened. We have to tell the police or the army or—" "To hell with that," said Rebecca, cutting Nolan off. "Unless we pay them half of our budget, they're going to take their sweet time. No, we're going out. Start loading up the truck." Without another word, Nolan and I started loading up the truck, with enough water, food and petrol to get us through 2 days in the desert. Rebecca grabbed our emergency satellite phone to keep trying to establish contact with the group that had gone missing. Within an hour of driving west, our last bits of Cairo that we could see had disappeared from the rearview mirror, and we were driving straight through the desert and over sand dunes in the direction of the satellite coordinates we received at the beginning of the expedition. On the way we spoke about every possibility of what could have happened, although nothing was fitting for the circumstances. If they had just run out of gas, or the vehicle had broken down, they would still be able to answer their satellite phone or send a message more descriptive than just SOS. We were at loss of what could have happened besides the vehicle breaking down. Location was far from a civilization. The nomads that occasionally passed through the area were known for being hostile, and there were no known terrorist groups in the area. At that moment I realized something that didn't particularly stand out to me, but now looking back on it, Should have been clearer, warning sign. The sun wasn't as bright as it usually was. We were right in the middle of the desert, no clouds or large trees, in sight that would have been blocking the sun. While I momentarily thought it odd, I didn't give it much more thought. I was, after all, a man of science and reason. Till the day, superstition and mythology, to me, were nothing more than interesting historical footnotes to consider while contextualizing archaeological finds. How I now long for those blissful, ignorant days. Once we were only an hour away from the coordinates of the research site. Rebecca asked Nolan to slow down. About 100 meters away, she spotted a person walking on the sand dunes. We changed directions to approach them. Maybe they knew where our friends were, or just needed help themselves. After all, it was highly unusual for someone to be just walking out in the desert, this far away from a civilization, especially without a camel or any form of transportation. "Hello?" Rebecca yelled out in Arabic, after we had driven close enough that we could get out and walk towards the stranger. He obviously heard us as he paused for a moment, but didn't turn around to face us, and just kept limping forward. Rebecca called out to him, in Coptic this time, thinking he may not have understood Arabic. Again, he just paused and continued on limping. Growing both impatient and concerned, Rebecca ran fast enough to get in front of him, to look at him directly. As soon as her face met his, she gasped and covered an expression of shock with her hands. He paused, facing her, after what was probably only a moment, but seemed longer. Nolan and I caught up to them to see what Rebecca was seeing. He had no eyes. Where there should have been 2 eyeballs, there were just black holes in the face, and he had dried streaks of blood going down from where his eyes used to be down his cheeks. His mouth was slightly open, but he had nothing to say. His lips were just trembling. The poor man was obviously traumatized. We stood in front of this man in silence for a few moments, but it seemed much longer than that. Then he started to fumble around us, and Rebecca grabbed the man by the arm and put it around his shoulder to prop him up. I got on his other side and put his arm around my shoulder so we could support him on both sides. We led him in the direction of the car, opposite the direction he was walking in when we found him. He had obviously been weakened by whatever had happened, but what little strength he had left, he devoted on attempting to turn around and continue the path he was walking in. Rebecca and I, with some force, helped him into the vehicle. "What the hell happened to him?" Nolan asked, after I had set the injured man down in a truck. I don't know," I replied, to see if she could say anything. She gave back an equally confused glance. "We'll get him to a hospital when we get back to Cairo," she said. "Our priority now, though, is finding the others." We continued driving in the direction of the coordinates in silence, which was only broken by our guest occasionally saying one word, "Yikes." None of us understood, but I have since learned that it is an Arabic word for reverse. He was trying to get us to turn around, and unfortunately, we paid him no heed. The sun kept growing hazier and hazier as we got closer to the site. but the events of the day had played tricks on our minds. We had believed that, if we had believed that it was much later in the day than it actually was, which in turn caused us to not pay attention to what was retrospect of very clear warning. We finally reached the site and were baffled when we saw nothing. I mean nothing. Typically, when ancient sites are reclaimed by the land, they form a hill in which everything ends up buried. This is how archaeologists usually get some indication of a site to constrict on. In this case, however, it's just a flat desert. Barely even a sand dune. If they're not here, then where are they? Nolan asked. Rebecca and I shot worried glances at each other, then back at Nolan. He had a point. If we hadn't seen them on the way to the site, and they weren't here, then where would they have gone to? The only other option was that they were lost, wandering in the desert, and given how vast and dangerous it was, they weren't likely to survive. Maybe they managed to get a hold of the police, or for something to get them? I asked. He would have been told then, Rebecca quipped back, very clearly frightened by every possible outcome of the situation. Guys, quiet for a second. Nolan shushed. We stood in absolute silence for a moment, with Rebecca and I giving Nolan confused looks. Nolan, what are you? I began before I cut myself off. I heard it. It was faint but getting closer. It sounded like hissing, the kind that a snake would make. Our concentration was broken by the sound of a truck door being opened. The man who we had picked up had stumbled out and was hysterically moving in the direction that we had came from. There was too much happening at once. Our friends were missing, the mysterious hissing noise, and now the mutilated stranger that we had picked up on the way was using whatever strength he had left to get as far away from the spot as possible. That was until I noticed the hissing grew closer the darker it got. Guys, what time is it? I asked, realizing that some things just weren't adding up. Nolan checked his watch. 3 p.m., he said, giving his watch and then the sky a look of confusion. None of us understood what was happening. It was almost close to twilight, with just a faint hint of sunlight in the sky. There was no question among us. We realized that we were in the way over our heads in trying to find our friends on our own. We headed over in the direction of the truck. Nolan got in the passenger seat, and I got in the back, while Rebecca headed over to grab our nameless friend. The next spot I've described to many officials. Egyptians, British and Americans. My eyes had been going for weeks at that point, so I couldn't see the faces of the Brits and Americans who interrogated me. But from the faint snickering I could hear in the background, I knew that I wasn't being taken seriously. Only the Egyptians seemed to at least take my story seriously. As Rebecca tried to grab onto his arm, a snake shot out of the sand. It wasn't any ordinary snake. It was only protruding only 8 feet from the ground, but just from the dimensions you could tell that there was much more to the creature, still below the surface. Rebecca turned around to face the monstrosity with a wide-eyed look. She seemed to be paralyzed. The memory of what happened played very slowly into my mind to this day. when in reality, it happened in less than a few minutes. The rest of the body of this massive snake emerged from the ground. It must have been at least 50 feet, but it materialized from the ground very quickly. As Rebecca stumbled backwards, the tip of the serpent wrapped its way around her, constricting her movements and bringing her closer to its face. One by one, it poked out her eyes with its forked tongue, savoring the taste as it shrieked into the empty desert. Then it ate her. All in one bite. One moment, she was there, screaming and struggling in the tail. And next moment, she was just a lump traveling down the gullet of the beast. Nolan was sobbing hysterically, while I was in stunned silence. We both wanted to turn away, but we just couldn't. The man we had found earlier was stumbling away as fast as he could, but the tip of its tail found him too. When seeing that he was already missing its eyes, the beast disposed of him the same way it did with Rebecca. I was hoping that I didn't know we were in the car. I was hoping that it would just leave me and that we could escape. I cursed at that moment, remembering that the keys to the truck were in Rebecca's pocket. I turned around to face the truck, faster than I could curse. A thrash of its powered tail had knocked the truck on its side, with Nolan and I being injured in a tumble. I laid there, unable to move, when it still entered the vehicle and wrapped around Nolan and pulled him out. It shattered glass off the window, giving him cuts as he was dragged out. I closed my ears as tightly as I could, but I could still hear his screams as he was eaten, following by one final scream, and then silence. I lay there whimpering, knowing that it would come for me, and it did. I felt it still wrap around me so tightly that I could barely breathe. It took me out of the same window as Nolan, giving me the same cuts on my extremities as it dragged me out. I was face to face with its ugly being, given barely any time to process the notion that I was about to die. It ate my left eye first. I shrieked in pain, just as Rebecca and Nolan did. His eye was blinded in that eye, the creature lapping at my eye and bloody hungry before it took my right eye. I could see the lights beginning to return to the horizon. I momentarily hoped that this would mean the end of my torture. It did, but not before it ate my other eye as well. I shrieked even harder as darkness consumed my world, and as I felt the warmth of the sunlight returning to my skin, I have no doubt that if the darkness remained, the giant snake would have consumed me whole as well. But I assumed the light drove it away as I realized me and buried its way underground. I wandered aimlessly in the desert in pain, after that having no sight. My shoes began filled with hot sand, and I could feel the sun beating down with me, and I was just ready to give up and die. Unfortunately, I was saved by the tribe of nomads, who generously took it upon themselves to transport me to Cairo, There I received some treatment and was transported back home to live a shell of my former life. I can no longer participate in archaeological digs or do many of the things I once loved. They make all those wonderful devices now, which can read for you and write out the words that you speak. It's how I maintained some work as a historian, and how I was able to get in touch with my co-workers from the university, who proceeded to let me know that more recent satellite photos appeared to show that the site we were sent to investigate just vanished, as if it never existed. My Arabic isn't as good as Rebecca's was, but I could understand some of what the nomads who found me were saying. The word that kept sticking out to me was Apep. After doing some research on the name, I realized what we had stumbled upon. I knew what had killed my friends and what had blinded me. I realized then that the ancient Egypts, with all the sophistication and knowledge, didn't venture out in the desert, not because they couldn't. They were very capable. They didn't because they knew better.